Hello and welcome. I'm Maria from Sew Through Time, and this time we're making 1780s stays. Now, the corset type of undergarment that built the structure and shape underneath 18th century gowns were called stays. And the way these were constructed in the 18th century was using this arch method, and they were constructed by tailors, whereas in English fashion most of women's clothing were constructed by mantua makers by draping. And this is also true for most of Europe, except for Scandinavia, where it was common for tailors to make all of women's clothing. Mantua makers were commonly women, whereas tailors were commonly men. And tailors, unlike mantua makers, had a proper guild and set of rules that what you needed to know in order to belong to that guild. And the requirements for all tailors were, of course, men's garments, and then women's riding habits and stays. Female mantua makers could sometimes make stays too, but they weren't trained in them like tailors were, and it was more common for them to make the less structured corset or jump type of garments rather than actual stays. Throughout the 18th century, the common fashionable shape that was made by these stays was a conical shape, but in the late 70s, we start seeing a shift towards the 80s and 90s silhouette, which has, on top of being conical, a clear bust thrust forward. And by the 90s, it was basically just the bust thrust. To achieve this bust thrust, the stays became a little bit lower and they fell further into the front so that it gave more room for the bust to fall outwards and forward instead of going to the sides, building that conical shape that was common in earlier periods. Because the silhouette becomes less rigid, less boning is used, so it's very common to see in 80s stays only partial boning, and especially towards the 90s, you start seeing less and less boning so that it is used basically only for those critical areas where it is needed for support, but nowhere else. The Patterns of Fashion outlines how to use this arch method to draft your stays, and I'm by no means an expert in this, so I'm not going to be showing how I drafted that basic shape to get that arch, because I couldn't really show you in any sort of cohesive way how I do it. But there are some excellent videos on how to do it, and I will link them down below. Also, a very important difference between modern stay making or corsetry or whatever and historical stay making in the 18th century would have been that in the 18th century they didn't really do mock-ups. The way these were done was that you take the measurements off your client, and then you would draft this arch where you would build the proper shapes, and then you'd cut them out of the fabric and make the stays almost fully done. And then your client would come back and you would fit them on the person and make any changes to the actual stays you need. This was done mainly because labor was cheap, but fabric was expensive. So it was more economical to make just the actual stays and then make any changes to that rather than making a separate mock-up and wasting a bunch of fabric. This is also my preferred method of working with, but of course with this method, there isn't a lot of room for error because you can take things in, but there's only so much you can let out. So you need to be fairly well versed in how to make the stays to your body and very familiar with your own body to make stays like this. So if you're making stays today and you're new to stay making, I would definitely recommend making a mock-up first. And if it does, by some miracle, just fit with just minor changes, you can also make that a wearable mock-up. That's what I've been doing for basically the past 2 years. I've been wearing my actual mock-up as my stays instead of actually finishing a pair. So I thought it was highly time for me to actually finish the real pair. So though my patterning is the historical method, I am not going to be making these completely historically today. I am going to be making them in a mix of modern techniques, but using the historical techniques where I feel personally that they are the most beneficial to the finished result. So while I won't be showing you how to create really that arc shape, The basic idea of the arc method of drafting stays is that you build this proper shape, this kind of triangle shape, where you build the stays onto. And the measurements are drafted on curved lines. You have your bust measurement, and then you have your waist measurement and your upper hip. Because your stays are supposed to come down to your upper hip, not end up at the waist, like you often see in modern reproductions. And then the tabs flare out from that upper hip so that you create that proper silhouette. Then after they had these basic measurements, they would, by eye, draft the actual shapes of the stays. And then any reduction to the waist would be done here. And yes, they did typically do some reduction because that creates the proper conical shape. It doesn't actually have to be a lot on your body, but it can be. And yes, tight lacing in stays is actually possible. And for me personally, I find that my stays are much more comfortable with some reduction than they are if they're exactly my waist size. But that again is a personal preference thing and how your body is built. For me, because I don't have much of a rib cage, there's no way that I could get any kind of conical shape if I didn't have that waist reduction. And though some waist reduction is normal and typical of stays, especially like the more curvy ones, they usually did not tight lace. But there is evidence, especially satire, of women actually tight lacing. So kind of take that with a grain of salt. That did they actually do it, or was it more men making fun of them? But it might have happened. Okay, here are my old stays laid on top of the new pattern. So one thing I want to make sure is that even though this pattern is slightly different, I want to make sure that the front edge is a little bit higher than in these ones. So I want to go there. So I'm going to change that from what I have drawn here.
And here I'm adding a little bit more reduction based on the fit of my previous stays. And I'm also adding a tiny bit more hip room. And now that my master pattern is done, I traced out the individual pattern pieces onto separate paper so that I can use them for cutting out my fabric, since in the master pattern the lines go on top of each other. If changes need to be made, it is made both to the master pattern and the drawn out pattern pieces, so that the drawn out pattern pieces can be used to make another pair of stays exactly the same as this one, or the master pattern can be used for drafting a new pair of stays when fashion changes. The seam allowances are added straight onto the fabric. For my fashion fabric and my innermost fabric, I'm using a mid-weight linen, and for my interlining, I'm using a lightweight old linen bedsheet. The center front and center back seams are stitched right sides together to form a clean edge for the lacing. And then the boning channels are sewn to the right side of all pieces. To mimic hand-sewn boning channels, I'm using a big, thicker buttonhole twist thread. Then I measure and cut my boning to the right length. I'm using zip ties, but synthetic whalebone is just as good. Then I round out the edges by sanding them so that they don't wear through the fabric so quickly. And then you insert the boning into the channels and trim down the seam allowance by half in all except the fashion fabric layer. And then clip the seam allowances where needed so that you can flip the seam allowance onto the inside. Now, historically, the seam allowances would be just whipped down with the raw edges showing, but because they would insert a lining, and I know myself, I'm never actually gonna get to that point, so I'm flipping it in so that the raw edges are on the inside and I'm hemming them down. Stays are closed with a spiral lacing rather than a crisscross lacing that is used in later corsets. Here I'm marking the lacing holes to make sure that they are evenly off-centered. And then the eyelet holes are pushed open with an awl. This keeps the fibers of the fabrics intact and making them much stronger. And then the edges of the eyelet holes are whipped to keep them open. Okay, now when all the individual pieces of the stays are the edges finished on the sides, so that only the top and bottom edges are left raw, it is time to connect these two edges. And the way we do it is by whip stitching them together, because when we get this finished stay, we want the whip stitches to connect them so that these pieces wrap really well around your body. The whip stitches kind of open like that, and then this can be bound with a ribbon, and this helps create the proper shape of the stays. You could do this modernly and just sew them together and then just whip the edges shut, but it won't exactly work the same way with use as this whipped does. This wraps around your body better and gives it a better motion, and also this is much sturdier because you're whipping it together with a thicker thread. I'm binding my stays with a Petersham ribbon, but other options would be a twill tape, usually linen, or leather. I wouldn't recommend bias binding because it wears out much too quickly. On the right side, I backstitch the ribbon on, whereas the back is more coarsely just hemmed on. I use a blunt tip darning needle to lace on the stays. For the straps, I added some Petersham ribbon. And here are the finished stays. Since these are front lacing, there isn't a pocket for the busk, so I just insert the wooden busk in once the stays are on. The wooden busk really helps with comfort as it evens out the pressure of the stays and keeps that front flat. As you can see, these have quite a bit of a lacing gap in the back and a little bit in the front. That is because especially linen stays like these ones tend to grow on you once they break into your body. So I don't want them to end up too big on me, but they usually are laced fully shut. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please hit that like button because it really does help out in this world. And I'll leave you guys with a view of the gown that goes over on top of these stays. If you're interested in how the different classes of the 1780s in England or the US would have dressed, I have a video up on that, so go ahead and watch that one. And I hope I'll see you again next time. Bye!